Hello, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on whichever part of the globe you are in. Hearty welcome to yet another edition of Learn from the Legends as we are in the 5th year of this series. We all know we have come a long way from expert opinions to evidence-based medicine, and the future is precision medicine. And that is where today's lecture and the legend who is going to present that comes into significance. We have the legend, I should call, in this field of artificial intelligence and how we can adapt that in healthcare and especially in our neonatology. And this is something that we need to actually learn from the basics, because most of us are not very good at this. So without wasting any more time, I welcome Professor Carolyn McGregor, Professor and Dean of Ontario Tech University, Canada, to this webinar. Hearty welcome, madam.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
Today, to moderate today's session, we have two prominent names in this part of the world. Professor Nishat Keshari Bhatta, professor of and neonatologist from BP Koirala Institute of Health Science, Dharan in Nepal. Hearty welcome, madam.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone.
And we have another great name in neonatology who has done some original work in this field, Dr. Srinivas Murthy, professor of pediatrics, and again, one of the leading names in southern India from JSS Medical College, Mysore, Karnataka. Hearty welcome, Dr. Srinivas.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
So without wasting any more time, I would request the moderators to take over, introduce our great legend today, and then start today's lecture. Thank you. Over to you, moderators.
Thank you very much, Dr. Manoj. And it is my great pleasure to introduce to you our Professor Caroline McGregor. She's a Dean of Faculty and Business and IT at Ontario Tech University and founding co-director of the Joint Research Center in AI for Health and Wellness between Ontario Tech University and the University of Technology, Sydney, Australia. She leads pioneering research in big data analysis, AI, edge computing, and data mesh infrastructure. She applies this leading edge research in her international and award-winning Armitage and Athena AI platforms for health, wellness, resilience, and adaptation in neonatology, astronaut health, firefighter training, and tactical officer resilience assessment and development. She is regularly called upon by the media to provide insight on the latest technology and trends. She has over 200 refer publications, more than 18 million in research funding, and 3 patents in multiple jurisdictions. She has deployed her Artemis platform in 2 hospitals in Ontario, leads Canadian D&D research contracts for new pre-deployment acclimation, skill, and resilience training. In 2022, she led a research study on the Axiom AX-1 first all-private astronaut mission, and she leads the space health study supported by Canadian Space Agency on the International Space Station. It was such a great pleasure. Thank you, Dr. Manoj, for asking me to introduce her, Professor McGregor.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. I really am delighted to speak to this audience. Neonatology has been at my heart for many years, and you will see that what I've been doing in neonatology has actually gone out from neonatology to space to firefighters and tactical officers. But today I'm going to focus on where we currently stand with artificial intelligence in neonatology. This talk is a companion to a new book chapter in a book that's coming out as part of this series. So I've been really delighted to put all of this material together, and I hope that you find it useful. So today I'm going to be covering a number of things within this area. First of all, I'm going to be talking about what is artificial intelligence, broadly, because there are situations where there's a little bit of interplay of use of terms. So I just want to set the scene on what some of these terms mean, just to really calibrate everybody. I'm going to talk about the problem of prematurity. I am a computer scientist, so you will hopefully allow me to present it from my perspective, because I'm looking at how it impacts artificial intelligence. And then I'm going to look at the diversity in the neonatal population again, and how that can impact what we learn with AI from prior collected data, and what we can do moving forward in clinical practice. I'll be talking about data collection and data pipelines. I'll be telling you about some recent surveys that have occurred in the literature, and you'll see that while some of the areas have been covered off in terms of what clinical discipline areas in neonatology are covered, they don't really go into the detail of how you implement these types of systems, which leads then into the bench to bedside discussion and where we stand. How we stand in the bench to bedside discussion. I've got some latest information on large language models. There's a lot of talk about ChatGPT and other large language models and what they can do for clinical practice. So I've got some interesting recent findings of the use in that area. And then really just drawing on some other aspects of deploying AI within clinical practice, what we can do in diverse resource settings. I've had the good fortune beyond our deployments in Canada to deploy or to look at deployment models in India in neonatology, as well as in the United States and Australia. And they all have different resource implications of what can be achieved. Then I'm going to close it off with a discussion on how I've gone from neonatology and how this has informed what we're now doing in space. So first of all, I want to talk about the term artificial intelligence. And I think this is a great example to have us calibrate on our definitions. So the outermost circle, the broad category of artificial intelligence, is the ability of a machine to imitate intelligent human behaviour. Now, that intelligent human behaviour can be statistical analysis, which is why the fields of those traditional areas of statistical analysis are still part of this broad area of artificial intelligence. And then within that is a subset called machine learning. And machine learning is the application of AI that allows a system to automatically learn and improve from experience. And then finally, within that, there's deep learning, which is the application of machine learning that uses complex algorithms and deep neural networks to train a model. And so it's in that area of deep learning where researchers and those who've deployed solutions are looking at how we can use our current understanding of the neural network pathways in the brain and how that's developed to be able to use that as a means to learn from data and deploy it. Now, a learning, evolving environment in AI can present challenges in terms of understanding what past performance has been achieved and therefore how you can implement that in clinical practice. And these are some of the things that we're going to explore as well today when we look at deployment. This is another diagram of the interplay between artificial intelligence, data science, big data, this phenomenon of machine learning and data mining. And while it puts artificial intelligence on the left-hand side with machine learning, and then there's big data and statistics on the other side, as you saw, this is where some of these definitions can get a bit skewed and people can have a misunderstanding, because artificial intelligence really covers all of the areas of machine learning with deep neural networks, data mining with deep learning, and then the other areas in data science of analytics, business intelligence, statistics, and data visualization. So that all is using a machine to be able to carry out function that we would normally do as humans. So there's a lot of discussion about how AI can be used and what we can do at the edge by the bedside, what we need to do in systems with greater resourcing. But there's a general consensus that we have a lot of opportunity to use artificial intelligence in many areas, as is indicated here in drug discovery, in improving the speed and accuracy of diagnosis, in electronic health records, robotic surgery, and in clinical trials. And in fact, in the last 2 years, there have been 2 quite substantive reviews of AI in neonatology, where they do recognise that AI is being proposed and analysed for a number of different areas within neonatology. For anything from automated neonatal seizure detection to detecting late onset neonatal sepsis, for the analysis of imaging data. It's being used really for quite a significant perspective. But before we go into those details, I wanted to talk about, and for us all to take a moment to understand where we are in our own bias towards technologies, including artificial intelligence. This is a great book. It's called Crossing the Chasm, and it's about technology, innovation, and adoption. And in this book, they talk about how through an innovation to deployment pathway, different people have different roles in their engagement with the technology. So there can be those early innovators and then the early adopters. And then once those early adopters have helped the innovators to really understand what happens as you're starting to roll out a technology, it leads to that early majority. And this, I think I can just go on to the next slide actually. Yep. So this represents your population, classic bell curve. So a small number of innovators provide technology to a set of early adopters who help to really start to understand the implications and the use of the technology, leading to the adoption of it by the early majority. And then that then flows on to those late majority people, those ones who really like to stay a little bit further behind technology and let everyone else sort out the glitches with technology first. And then we have what we know as the laggards, those who flow on later. And I think that what's important to realise in all of this is that we all have our own personal bias for our own personal technology, and then there's what's happening in our working environment and where we calibrate to in this adoption cycle. So I'm not doing any product placement, but to use it as an example, this is a remarkable note taker, and I was what's classed as an early adopter for this because I pre-ordered it as a digital a notebook, and I really wanted to try it out. There's other technologies I might wait to be an early majority on. And then in my workplace at the university, again, it's making different choices about what technology that it's going to be using. So we have to keep that in mind when we think about the deployment of AI as well in neonatology. Now, this is a systematic review that was performed in 2019 of AI in a number of disciplines. Now, one thing that I will say is that artificial intelligence is actually part of a broader field called, or its application in healthcare, it's part of clinical decision support systems. And AI broadly is part of decision support systems. So we always have to think about when we're looking at these types of systemic reviews, whether or not it's a true indication of what's happening in the area, because there's some clinical decision support systems that may not use the term AI, but they certainly have all of the attributes of AI. If you're looking for neonatology in this list, at this time in 2019, there were only 10 articles that were found. But what's interesting is these 2 reviews that have been completed recently, one of them I've referenced here, because they actually quantify what they found in terms of the number of articles. And we really are seeing an explosion. This was in PubMed. And so they scanned PubMed, used the term AI in neonatology, found 848 articles that referenced that as a concept, compared to adult care areas where there was 23,442 articles. So now you could argue that there's many, many different discipline areas in adult care, but nonetheless, two things are striking. There's a significant increase from 10 to 848. But also, disparity between what's happening in neonatology and what's happening in adult care. What I also found interesting in this particular systemic review, and also the review that was performed by the other review, and I reference both of these in the book chapter, none of my work is included in it. Now, whether they didn't find it in PubMed, and I know they certainly didn't go to other areas of computing and engineering publication areas. So what they were predominantly covering is what discipline areas are being covered, a little bit of a discussion about whether any of it's deployed and impacting clinical practice, but certainly just trying to understand what people are trying to do from a mechanics perspective with looking at AI in neonatology. This, I know, is something that's extraordinarily familiar to all of you. What's been interesting for me is, as I said at the beginning, when you think about neonatology and how we want to look at artificial intelligence, we have to fundamentally think about the fact that it's a small human trying to survive in a foreign environment. Depending on their gestational age at birth, they require mechanical ventilation or other support to be able to survive outside the womb. And trying to survive in this external environment where the heart has to change its function, the lungs then are providing the oxygen, and they're also now in a gravity-based setting, lying in a bed as opposed to in the amniotic fluid. As you all know, there are these different challenges. Now, the reason I've mentioned particularly retinopathy of prematurity, sleep-wake cycling, late-onset neonatal sepsis, apnea of prematurity, anemia of prematurity, early-onset neonatal sepsis and necrotizing enterocolitis is that these are conditions that we've been researching in my work at looking at, is there a non-invasive markers that we can see in heart rate and breathing and heart rate variability, blood oxygen saturation, etc., that show us new pathways that previously weren't known for the pathophysiology of disease. Now, other things to keep in mind as we try and do this, that not all 24-weekers are born the same. As an example, or at any gestational age, as much as we think by the certain gestational ages we will have a certain amount of organ development, and some of these conditions will be more or less of interest. Retinopathy of prematurity, not as of interest if the baby's born after 32 weeks. But if there is a 24-weeker who has been without amniotic fluid since about 16 weeks, their lungs haven't been able to develop in the same way as a 24-weeker who has had amniotic fluid, who has been born premature for different reasons. So we have to keep in mind how we work out providing all of that context information to an artificial intelligence environment. Our ultimate goal, as I said, this is an example from late onset neonatal sepsis, where an infant was seen to be a feeder and a grower, and then less than 12 hours later was diagnosed or with suspicion of sepsis, and they were put on antibiotics, etc. And this is for all of you practicing in neonatology, this is a common challenge for you. And are there those subtle cues that the baby's body is starting to show in physiological data streams that can provide us with this sort of information? Now, equally, as I said in the literature review, people are trying to understand lung maturity with imaging analysis. They're trying to understand whether they can detect seizures with AEEG, because that is more of a cost-effective and a way that you can deploy, brain monitoring rather than an EEG. But the challenge with all of these is you're trying to monitor that tiny infant, all the time. And what degradation does that have if you're trying to then introduce all of this monitoring all the time? So as I've already mentioned, I tried to work out a good graphic to use that infants are at different gestational ages. They have different complications that imply whether or not they're small for their gestational age, appropriate, or large for their age, whether or not the complete developmental pathway is indicative of that particular gestational age, or if they have some areas that they're lacking just because of the experience prior to be born, preterm or even at term. So it presents a lot of challenges in that overall landscape. And so as a summary lens, we know that we have to consider the bias in the study population. And then how do we take information from anyone who has been on a voyage of discovery in neonatal data and has proposing, sorry, that should be pattern recognition and cluster. Trying to look at what their particular study means to them. So what's the age distribution of the infants? Does that particular unit go down to 22 weeks gestation, or do they only start at 23? In which case that is biased in a population compared to a unit where they are taking or resuscitating down to 22 weeks. Biological sex is important. Generally, in the AI population, there's a view about considering the gender construct, which is more of a societal construct as opposed to biological sex. In the neonatal population, however, we have just been working with biological sex because they're not in a position to self-identify their own gender. With biological sex, we know that the resting heart rate of males and females is different. The resting heart rate of a female is 8 points higher. It's still not well known whether that exists in the neonatal population right from conception or certainly birth. But it's certainly something that's showing in a number of publications in the adult population. Race is something that has not been well studied. There was only one study in these literature reviews where they recognised that the outcomes or the performance of the AI is impacted by the bias of the limited set of races in America that were studied for that particular AI. In Canada, we're not allowed currently to collect race in the electronic health record. Canada is quite a multicultural society, but indicatively, and some of you can possibly relate to what I'm going to say, that I've been told in many, many units around the world that girls tend to do better than boys in the neonatal unit, but boys who are of African descent do better than other boys of different races. Now, that's, as I said, anecdotal information, but I've heard it many, many times. Yet we don't collect race information and we can't include it in our models at the moment. Geographic location also can play a part, and the socioeconomic frame within which the mother was going through the pregnancy. So as much to say that we just don't know yet what all of these things can mean. We need to continue to try and collect data and all contribute to the development of these different models. So in 2009, I deployed an environment called Artemis in one of the hospitals in Toronto. It was using a particular streaming software provisioned by IBM, not used in this type of medical context before. It had been used in a national security context to monitor other sensors. But the idea was to take data from these medical devices and see how we could look for two things: start collecting data to do our retrospective research on what markers are in place before the onset of certain conditions, but also just try and deploy some clinical rules that were known as the standards at the time, particularly for late onset neonatal sepsis. So we have a lot of data that we collect in this context. If you think about the fact that a neonate's heart can beat around an average of 130 beats a minute, that's nearly 8,000 times in the hour, double an adult. Respiration rate They're breathing at about over 2,000 times in the hour. We take blood oxygen saturation every second, so that's 3,600 readings in the hour. Some babies can have 13 infusion pumps attached to them. You could also potentially be gathering data from the ventilator. And to gather information about the actual heartbeats, it's usually an electrocardiogram at 500 or 1,000 readings a second. And this isn't even including the AEEG or EEG. So a lot of data that we have to look at ways with how we can collect it. And in our work, we've worked with a range of different devices. We've worked with the Philips IntelliVue monitors. We've had the GE Dash monitors, the 2 monitors we've used in Canada. But then in a unit in India where we were working on a deployment just before COVID hit, the Nellcore device that you can see on the screen at the bottom as a blood oxygen saturation or plasmography device is the one that was available in that unit. We have to think about, as hospitals acquire these types of machines, how can we extract the data out of these machines so that it can flow on. So in the diagram on the right-hand side, you have a series of patients, and these different devices are collecting and showing the data, but an artificial intelligence platform needs to have that data flowed through. Now, in the case of the Philips device, a highly proprietary output interface, they connect that through to central monitoring. But if you want to connect on to one of the output ports, it's not that the internet port is available. We had to use one of the serial ports, but even the format of the data, they don't freely publish what that format is. So you need to use these device connectors to be able to connect to it. The GE Dash monitor only allowed us to connect to their central monitoring system. So we could only extract the heart rate information every 2 seconds. We couldn't go down to the electronic, sorry, the ECG, electrocardiogram. We couldn't use that to pick the R peaks and go do our RR interval analysis. And then with the plasmography device, the output of that literally was output to a screen or a printout every few seconds. And again, it's just literally the format that would be going to a printer, and we didn't have that raw signal. So we're always limited by the devices. And I would encourage all of you, when you're cycling the devices at the bedside, that you understand how do we get the data out of the devices? If it is a priority in your unit to try and look at how you can utilize this data more, you need to make sure as you're deploying new monitoring devices that you can get the data out of them. So fundamentally, all of this type of data that I'm focusing on today, so I'm not talking much about imaging and EEG, it's focusing on some of for my work because I want to show some of the deployment opportunities and challenges, even in this particular setting. This type of data is known as big data. It has a significant volume because it's just the sheer amount of the data, the velocity, that 500 readings a second of an ECG, that blood oxygen saturation every second, that's the velocity of the data. Variety of signals, as I've said. Veracity refers to the quality of the data. Now, a lot of units have a clinical practice where they try and leave the neonates to sleep and bundle their interventions when the neonate's awake. That does actually create opportunities for a really great signal collection while the baby's sleeping. That's different to a lot of other neonatal units. For example, in neurology, they'll wake a patient up every hour to assess their neurological state, and that causes a lot of interruptions in the signals. So again, these numbers that I've already mentioned before, we have a large amount of data. So how do you create a system that can ingest the fire hose of data that's coming from these preterm and illiterm infants? It is not something that electronic health records have built within their capacity. They are looking for other systems that can be able to do this. An infusion pump, as I mentioned before, we've seen situations where a baby has 13 infusion pumps attached to them. So in our work, one of the things that we've done, and this is what's being reported on a lot in the literature reviews that I was reviewing, it's the work of exploratory AI. Having access to some data and then exploring. One of the challenges, though, with the exploratory AI is, do you understand the clinical presentation, that pathophysiology that's being detected? And in many cases, not. In my work, however, I feel that it's very important to provision the actual clinical understanding of what's being found. So we use a range of exploratory AI techniques. I won't go into the details of them today, but we explore to find associations, and then we use other techniques to further refine and take that subset of information to work to learn on what are those patterns in the physiological data streams. And that's one of the things that we've been able to achieve. So here is an example of some of the work that we've done with heart rate variability and respiration rate variability. So very simple two-dimensional array here, that if the heart rate variability and respiration rate variability is in what we call the baseline range, then the baby is a feeder and a grower from this perspective of the conditions that we're looking for. If the heart rate drops, it could be sepsis. It could also be that the baby needs blood transfusion. And one of the things that we've been able to do by including the both heart rate and respiration rate variability is to work out or to start to see that the two instances of LONS, even a baby post-surgery, which we'll get to in a minute, and also blood transfusion, LONS and blood transfusions show very different behaviours and responses to the interventions as well. Down the bottom right, you'll see when both respiration and heart rate variabilities are low. This is usually when the infant's on some form of a sedative type drug like fentanyl, morphine or midazolam. We also interestingly found it's very rare for respiration rate variability to be low, but heart rate variability to be in a normal range. So from a clinical perspective, that was interesting. So we're quantifying what we're finding, what is that pathophysiology, but then we have to create a system to be able to watch for these things in real time and assess the clinical efficacy, etc. So this brings me to pipelining for artificial intelligence. Now, I usually sort of debate about which diagrams to include and how to discuss the work that I do, but in this particular situation, it was really important to talk about the components that we have in Artemis, because it helps you to understand just the complexity that needs to be implemented in a robust way to have these types of systems in place. So before I mentioned that you can be having these medical devices at the bedside that are collecting data, but your AI system has to connect to those devices and it has to be able to acquire the data from those devices. Now, whether the rest of the system is in the hospital or outside, as it's being shown here that it's outside in a cloud infrastructure, you want to start buffering and collecting the data as a fault tolerance thing. And you want to transmit it through to the next components in your artificial intelligence system. And if the network in the hospital goes down, or if the network infrastructure from the hospital to the cloud infrastructure location of the analytics environment, depending on how you deploy it, if that goes down, you want to have had the data buffered, otherwise you just lose it. In some of our deployments in India, where we were looking at what architecture to put in place here, when this type of buffering component has a price point of $1,000 US per bed space, as an off-the-shelf provider that can connect to lots of different medical devices, that becomes a challenge in many countries. So for the Nelcore device, we were writing our own, because it was quite a simple output that we had from the Nelcore device. So we were writing our own extraction mechanism for that to send the data through, but having to write the buffering component manually becomes more complex. So the data is being sent through to the back-end infrastructure with the AI, where we, in real time, we feed the data through this, what's called an adaptive API. It has to read data from lots of different medical devices. And then we feed it through, and we have a range of algorithms that run in real time. And they're all watching for either known clinical rules that have been established because of past clinical practice, or new rules that we are trying based on what we've learned. And then we have to think about making that available. In our work, we've run Artemis in what's called silent mode. So that means that this whole infrastructure runs in the background, but the actual alerts are not provisioned to the clinicians. We compare it later to what happened clinically at the bed space. This was deployed, as I mentioned, in 2 hospitals within this type of infrastructure. 2 hospitals in Ontario, McMaster Children for 51 level 3 bed spaces, South Lake Regional Health for 17 level 2 bed spaces to assess reliability. It was a deployment over 213 days that we reported on the availability, and we had 88% of the bed spaces at McMaster Children's achieved greater than 99.5% availability of the data, and 100% of the bed spaces at South Lake were able to achieve the 99.5% availability of the entire system. We had a number of issues with bedside devices at McMaster, including one that started to smoke from an electrical fire and had to be replaced. This work initially was covered in a book that you may or may not have heard about called The Patient Will See You Now, as these new types of precision medicine approaches to try and look at how we can deploy these artificial intelligence systems to impact clinical care. This was one of the earlier algorithms that we deployed prior to that performance one. This was a deployment at the Hospital for Sick Children. What I wanted to show you here is that this is a summary. Every vertical line is an hour, so there's around 3,600 or just under readings that we get analytics from. If everything is okay, the heart rate, respiration, blood oxygen, and blood pressure, then it's dark blue. If there's an issue with heart rate, it is light blue. An issue with heart rate, blood oxygen saturation, it's yellow. Those two plus, all of those together with blood oxygen saturation, it's pink. And then blood pressure, if it's all of those and blood pressure, it's red. So you'll see as we go across over the time that over here, the picture is changing. There's clearly some differences in the signals that are coming through. And it was this second position from the right where there was a clinical suspicion at the bedside of late onset neonatal sepsis. So for us, it's not just about heart rate variability, because changes in heart rate variability can actually be associated with a number of different conditions. This is an oxygen analytics one that we use for retinopathy prematurity, literally looking at how many seconds in the hour it's in the target range for our oxygen levels. In our research, we have found that it is the variability above and below oxygenation target ranges. There's a higher incidence of ROP rather than just over-oxygenation, but it does require further research. Here is another example. I'm just trying to quickly move through these slides. One of the other pieces that we have to do with these types of systems is provision the information to the right person or people on the care team at the right time. Neonatologists, nursing staff, all of the other care practice disciplines, they go on and off shift. They look after different infants in different wards. So one of the things that we implemented as a demonstration was an interface to QGender. So QGender is a rostering system that's used in McMaster Children's Hospital. So we demonstrated how we could, whenever there were alerts that were coming out of this real-time environment that somebody needed to be notified at the bedside, these alerts would utilise the rostering system to understand who needed to receive the information on a ward basis, who was on shift, and then that could then be provisioned through to either a text message or an email just to test both of those, and then we log all the different notifications. But these are the practical realities of what you need to do, and all these different components that you need to establish if you want to be able to run a system in real time. And I haven't even covered off the clinical efficacy piece, and which is why I mentioned before that we've been running systems in the background in silent mode to be able to not just show the reliability and availability and the security of the systems, but also to be able to ensure that we're gathering that information about the efficacy of the algorithms and their impact on clinical care. As I already mentioned, it's really important to consider as you're procuring equipment to be ready to be able to have that equipment and to be able to extract the data from that equipment and feed it through. And this is, we can think about separating what happens in the healthcare organisation to what happens in a cloud, and do we call it health analytics as a service? You know, what's that right phrase, or clinical decision support, or AI? You know, this is why just doing searches on the term AI is problematic, because in engineering and computing disciplines, we're using some different terminology along the way. And, you know, is it really prediction that we're trying to achieve, or is it that we're, in our case, we're really trying to work on detection, because we believe that our research is showing us certain markers. So we're trying to detect those. We're not trying to predict things. I want to talk a little bit about large language models. I'm just trying to quickly whiz through these slides now. Historically, there was a need to understand literature, medical literature, and to be able to draw from the medical literature new clinical practice information to impact care. That would require a lot of individual review of lots of different articles to try and do that yourself. And I have this interesting parallel example about the innovation to create a dishwasher. And that initially, when there was a lot of work to try and create dishwashers, they were trying to replicate what a human was doing and using robotic arms. And this is more of a modern photo, but this is what they were doing back in the day, believing that they had to deploy robotic arms to replicate what a human was doing to be able to wash the dishes. But then somebody realised, well, hang on, we're just trying to achieve washing dishes. We don't have to replicate the human. So how can we create a structure to wash dishes? And that's what we have today with our dishwashers. So, you know, one of the things you can do is make lots of journals online. Those journals can then be available, that you can explore them digitally online instead of on paper. And that's like taking the robotic dishwashing arms and just, you know, implementing that. But what we're trying to do now is utilise these large language models to actually do the exploration and synthesising of the information in this context. Large language models have actually been around for some time. When I was back in the day studying computer science, we were using ELIZA and some of these other tools, learning how to respond to certain words that someone would be putting onto a line editor so that the computer would have a conversation. And of course, these have accelerated in their functionality to tools like we have now with ChatGPT, but they're not new. They just have more functionality. But what I want to draw your attention to is this particular model that's been established in terms of how do you create a trusted source for the medical knowledge, and then another source for the language model development. So this diagram shows some work on an initiative called NHS LLM, where you take the general knowledge area to construct language and trusted sources to take the medical knowledge in to be able to then create this particular environment where you're using trusted medical knowledge as your interface. And this is an example of OpenGPT implementing this, where the question is on a presentation of a 35-year-old woman with abdominal distension, nausea and vomiting, and what are the possible diagnoses, and they're presented there. So these are the types of things that are happening now. Of interest, just in the last couple of months, an article's been published about ChatGPT and the neonatal board examination. So they use version 3.5 with 936 eligible questions. They had to exclude questions with imaging and equations, which is a really important thing to think about what AI can and can't do at the moment. So it did have, with those 936 questions, 45% overall correctness, with the lowest performance in gastroendocrinology and the highest performance in areas like ethics. It performed poorly when there was multi-logical questions, and best in areas where it's just doing a recall and basic clinical reasoning. But it did have significant issues with a number of factually incorrect answers. So that's some current information of people trying to look at what can be done in this area. As we continue to go through, again, I would encourage you, as you think about what to do in your own units and what to try and look at in terms of initiatives to start, that always with technology you consider the implicit bias that you have, understand your attitudes in work and the way you're looking at it. Technology, usually that's considered to be mysterious. If it's non-human-like and complex, people have a bias towards those, which is why the artificial intelligence, if it's given a humanoid type interface, people actually increase their trust perception of it. And all we've done is bolt on a humanoid animation mechanism with text coming through, and the humanoid speaks the text, and suddenly that makes it more trustworthy. So we have to really get back to going under the cover of what the AI is doing, what it's not doing, and how we can implement it in our own neonatal settings, which is what I'm showing here with the avatars. The AI avatar that is being shown is a separate component to the large language model, is a separate component to the real-time streaming analytics of what's happening at the bedside. They are all separate technology components that are bolted together to come up with a complete pipeline solution. Within data, within the training, you can have mismatched data and a mismatched scope for the training. So you really always have to be looking at those articles on AI and where did they get their data from? What's the bias in the data set? What does that mean for my population? And considering that as you move forward. Different ways that AI gets presented. These are all diagrams that represent my system that different people have used. This was a sketch that was put with one of my articles about my work, whether they're considered as digital twins, another diagram about my work as well. All of those are showing us. I do want to try and make sure we have some question time, so I'm going to go quickly through these. There are things that are known and things that we know we don't know, but there are things that we don't know that we don't know. And whenever we go exploring in the data, that's when we make these discoveries about new aspects to the data that we didn't know. I don't think what I'm doing is replacing neonatologists. There are many reasons for that. Signal quality, what we can implement within them. These are tools. And if you read Prediction Machines, another great book, in Prediction Machines, they say the best AI solution is when you utilise the strengths of the human with the strengths of what we can do in AI and bring the two together, which I think is really important. There's a lot of hype around AI at the moment. There's a lot of hype to say AI can do everything, and I really don't think that it can. And Gartner Group really talks well about technology hype. And we're getting to the point around negative press as well, around ChatGPT and, you know, it making up things. And you really do have to be careful that if you don't tell it to use bona fide sources, it'll make up text because it doesn't know any different. In 2 minutes or less, so this will be quick, my research taking this idea of ingesting high-speed physiology and understanding how the body's adapting to the environment is part of some studies in space. It's related to a stress algorithm I won't go into today. That's one of the things we're looking at. I've used it on a number of analog missions initially. This was one we ran in Russia that I was part of in 2015. And the analytics is showing how the participants are moving around over different days. On the left, it's a average every day, and on the right, it's every 5 minutes. So, you know, lots of opportunities. This is my space mission that's running currently on the International Space Station. It's called Space Health. I monitor the physiology of astronauts on Earth in space and when they come back down again. Again, just understanding how their body's adapting, and I've taken what I've done in neonatology up to space. Also part of the AX-1 mission, and we're working on being part of future Axiom private astronaut missions as well. This all means we need to do this as we try and explore further in space. It's also relevant for tactical officers and firefighters, how their body how their physiology is changing when they're in the theatre of operation, and also military personnel deploying to different climates. So lots of different aspects. This is this prediction machine a book that I spoke about before. It's written by The Economist or some economists in Toronto. It's a very good read in terms of understanding the role that AI can play. I put this up as a sort of a closeout This now is 100 years old. From Radio News, their initial concept of a radio doctor, somebody who can provide remote care. This technology would have worked. You can actually find this full magazine online now and read the article, but they did it as a bit of a joke because they didn't understand why anybody would want to provide remote care back in 1924. So all of the work that I presented today, it's part of our Joint Research Centre in AI for Health and Wellness, where we study humans in the extremes. I want to thank all of my research partners on the work, and you can follow my work. There's some links here on Twitter, the Space Health link. I'm also on Instagram for CP McGregor and on LinkedIn. So I hope you found this interesting, and I am happy to take any questions. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Professor Caroline. It was an extensive talk, and you really did cover very well in a short duration of time. I think there was a lot of technical jargons which some of us really found a bit difficult to understand, but later on the talk, we could really understand what you were talking. And the first thing that I noticed was AI is such a big opportunity in healthcare, and particularly in neonatology. And most of us, probably including I would say 99% of us, are still trying to understand the scope of it in the healthcare. And with this talk, I think we were all convinced that in future, most of us have to direct ourselves to focus on artificial intelligence getting interfaced with the day-to-day management. I think that was a wonderful talk. I thank you for your presentation. It was full of stuff. So I would like you to answer a few questions. Dr. Nisha can.
Yeah. Ma'am, there is a question from Sering Dorje. He wants to know, did you do any research on AI in neonatal advanced life support? He wants to know any research you have conducted in neonatal advanced life support.
So what do you mean by advanced life support? So in terms of resuscitation or...
I think he is asking about the resuscitation part of it. The one which we understood was more in day-to-day management of neonatology. Dr. Shilling was more focusing on duration, I mean, at the time of resuscitation.
So we deployed, as I mentioned, that there were 51 bed spaces that we deployed at Master Children's. 3 of those were in the delivery suite. So we were collecting data from as soon as the devices were being connected to the infant through the resuscitation process. So we really are limited by when the devices are connected to the infant as to when we can get that data. But we did have data that we collected from infants that were resuscitated in those delivery suites.
Yeah, I think in a nutshell, it's going to really occupy most of the spaces in neonatal management. And I think we should be just open for it. There are a few other comments. They were all thanking you profusely for this illuminating talk. I think that's all the question we have.
So, ma'am, they are asking, is any online course to adopt AI in health science in neonatology? Do you recommend some?
This is a great question and something that we have been discussing. How do we do the educational component both on the neonatal side and the on that area generally, pediatrics area, neonatal, but also how do we create that specialised knowledge for computer scientists and engineers? For me, it's funny, I'm not a neonatologist, as I said. People often ask me, were you a computer scientist and then a neonatologist? I'm like, no, I'm not a neonatologist, but I spend a lot of time going out to the neonatal units. But I do think that we do need to look at this development of certification programs to help people to understand and to bridge both ways so that we can upskill and create that workforce who can be implementing and supporting and creating these types of systems that can be utilised in clinical practice and their efficacy tested, for sure.
There's one more very similar question. I think you the answer that you just gave suits that he is asking, he or she, I don't know because they're anonymous. How do I prepare myself from now on for AI? Is there learning that I can do for preparedness and embrace technology? Basically, I think we need to be open for the opportunities. There is one more question, Dr. Aarti Avinash. She has asked, have you used the research during COVID-19 in NICU?
You know, that's a really interesting question. So the system was operational and running right up until March of 2020. It's a system that was monitoring for infection, so bacterial and viral infection, that we were instructed to turn off by the ethics board because it was running under a research study and all studies were stopped during COVID-19. So in our case, it was a real shame that we could not keep it running. And we were watching other researchers comment about the maturity of the lung and whether or not neonates were developing COVID-19 from situations where the mother had it prior to birth, whether they were susceptible to it in the hospitals, and the incidence levels were quite low, if not if existent even at all. But unfortunately, we had to turn our system off.
Ma'am, there's a more interesting question from Dr. Aarti. She was asking, how do you help astronaut in space using AI?
Oh, good question.
I think, yeah.
Yeah, so their physiology changes in space because of the absence of gravity, the distribution of blood, the blood volume changes, and it impacts cardiac function. So we watch for a couple of things. Through that two-dimensional phase plane that I demonstrated, we watch for short-term stress and the impact on long-term reserves. And we watch that in heart rate variability. But we're watching as their body goes through that adaptation process of reducing the fluid volume and also changing the distribution through and even the generation of new blood. So we're watching all of that as a means to try and keep them within acceptable ranges while they're in space, because we also know that it takes the amount of time they're in space once they get back to Earth for their body to readjust back to Earth. So I hope that answers the question.
Ma'am, that is one of the last questions that's almost similar. So Prakash, Soni and Ashwini is asking, any tool that are accessible and beneficial for neonatal care in low resource setting, like they're in the limited facility sepsis in low resource setting?
So this was one of the things, this is why we started to do that work in India ourselves. Because we have to think about how we can extract the data from the devices that you have and do that in a cost-effective way. The cloud infrastructure we can implement quite efficiently from a cost perspective. It's the connection to the bedside devices, which is why particularly for this talk today, I mentioned about how we were connecting to that Nellcore device. That Nellcore device has been around for decades and its output is quite simple. So for all of you thinking about what you can do in low resource, if you're in that low resource setting, the first thing to think about is what medical devices do I have? Because that's the first step. Because if you're not collecting initially the data, then you don't have that data to utilize. And then with the devices that you have, is it possible to get the data out of the device? Is it technically possible from the back of the device? And then the rest of it is building those connection systems.
There is one more question from Dr. Ashwini Sood. Might be it has a little bit of, you might find it difficult to answer. You might decline if you want to. She says, how to take along gynecologists to utilize AI in the labor room to reduce neonatal sepsis? I'm not sure if you can really answer this question.
Sorry, what was it? I heard that the question was about neonatal sepsis and AI, but I wasn't. So is the question, how do we utilize AI with neonatal sepsis?
No. She's asking, how can we convince our gynecology colleagues, the obstetric colleagues, to be on the same page, which This is probably a difficult question for me to answer. It might be if you can try.
Yeah. So the best way that we're trying to convince is through outcome-driven data. So we have the publications that have just been held up for a few different reasons on the performance of our system running for those 213 days in silent mode. But I've also done what's called null hypothesis, or with the scientific method, I've done null hypothesis testing to check and test those particular features that we're looking for right across the whole spectrum. Is it firing at other times? So we are trying to generate the evidence that as a clinical marker, the features that we're looking for that we believe are early onset indicators in the changes in heart rate and respiration and blood oxygen saturation are markers that allow us to detect earlier and give us the potential to impact outcomes. That's the approach that we're taking.
The next three questions are pretty much answered already. One question asks about what do we need in our neonatal setup to start AI in the initial phase, which you have already answered, that we need to have equipments to give the data from their back.
Yep.
And another question from the same person, I believe, is use of AI during resuscitation, which has been answered.
Great.
Thank you very much, ma'am. It was a great pleasure, very interesting lecture to go through. We all are just the basics of AI, and we're trying to learn. Now, since because of the time, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Manoj for the further.
Nope, and you're on mute. There we go.
Madam, I was saying you continue to amaze us with every lecture of yours, and this is no exception to that. No, thank you so much for a highly illuminating lecture. It was, very actually thought-provoking and useful for the beginners. Who are novice in this field, and then we hear about this from people like you, and then that I'm sure the youngsters will get take this forward to the next level. So again, thank you so much for sparing your time. I know already you are late for your next event.
Fine.
So it's such a honor, and we hope to host you whenever you travel to this part of the world. Whenever you come to India, we hope to host you. Thank you so much, madam.
It'll be my honor and pleasure.
Thank you.
And I would also like to thank both the moderators, Dr. Nisha and Dr. Srinivas, for very well managing time and moderating this session. We had to end. So you had done it wonderfully. Thank you so much.
You are the energy behind that, Dr. Manoj.
And before we end this session, I would like to thank all of you respected attendees who have been with us for the last 5 years. And it's such a honor to have you join this series until we meet next month. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.